veterinary feed directives, there's more questions folks have related to them, and so I'm going to spend some time talking about both of these topics today with you today. So where I'm going in this presentation today, I'm going to go through the drugs that are approved and indexed for fish. I'm also going to talk about extra-label use regulations and policies. And then I'm going to highlight in the second part of my presentation a recent change that certain products are now have moved from over-the-counter status to requiring a veterinarian to write either a veterinary feed directive or a prescription for use. I'm going to explain exactly what a veterinary feed directive is and then point to resources for additional information at the end. So just as background, the definition of a drug is an article intended to diagnose, treat, cure, mitigate, or prevent disease, or anything that affects the structure or function of an animal. Those are things that fall under the drug definition. And for a drug approval, these are the things that need to be addressed. We look at the effectiveness of the product. Does it do what it says it's going to do? Control the disease it says it's going to do. We look at target animal safety. If you're applying it to fish, is this product safe for the fish, or are there going to be some adverse toxicity events? We evaluate human food safety so that the residues aren't going to be an issue of concern when people are eating the food, the meat or the fillet. We also evaluate environmental impact. We look at the manufacturing of the product to make sure that the product is consistently manufacturing, has proper controls. What you're expecting in the bottle or the bag is what you're going to get. We look at the labeling to make sure that everything on there is accurate. And we also look at all other information. So not just the pivotal studies that companies or researchers will do to support the drug, but all information out there to make sure we're not missing something before we approve a drug. So if you look at these things, they were all incorporated in law for a reason, to give consumers confidence in the approval of a drug, that what you're getting is going to do what it says it's going to do, it's safe, that you're getting the product that you're expecting to get. And again, it gives you confidence that if you're treating a food animal, that you're not going to have issues of human concern, toxicity to humans, with residues from that drug in the treated animal. So again, I'm going to go through the drugs that are, briefly go through the drugs that are approved so you can see what's out there. I'll start with the medicated articles and medicated feeds. I'm going to list the product names that are approved and all the approved indications. So each drug is approved for specific uses, and companies can expand the label to include more uses as they go along. But at this time, these are the things that are approved. So I'll leave them up for a little bit each time so you can scan for the diseases that might be of importance to the industry you're looking at. So one of the medicated feeds that is approved is Aquaculture. We also have Terramycin 200 for fish, Romet 30 and the Romet TC, and the sulfamerazine for fish is approved but hasn't been marketed in a while. So again, these are the indications, and everything's specifically approved for a specific dose, what amount this medication is going to be at, and for how long you're going to treat. That's all part of the approval. And again, these are product-based. We don't just an approval is for Terramycin 200 for fish, not any oxytetracycline dihydrate product, because again, we're looking at the specific formulation of the drug and the manufacturing of those drugs. We have a few immersion products that are approved. So again, as you know, these are bath products. They're going to be administered to the water that the fish are in, or contain, whether it's in the raceway tanks or in a separate container for smaller groups of fish. There's the Helmet Aquachloramine T product, several formalin products for the indications that I've listed on the screen. And all of these are also available on our website. We have a database called Animal Drugs at FDA. You can look for that and enter in whatever drug you need, whatever drug you're interested in. It'll tell you what it's approved for, again, what the treatment conditions are, what the withdrawal periods are, withdrawal period being how long the fish need to be held after treatment before release into public waters, or going to market. 35% peroxide is approved, as well as several oxytetracycline hydrochloride products for immersion. And then the tricane S is approved for immobilization of fish. We have one injectable product that's approved for fish, and that's Corulon to aid in spawning. There are some other categories that I wanted to go through with you so you understand what they are and how they're different from approvals, and then I'll also talk about extra label use. So there's a category of legal marketing status that we call it is conditional approval. This is an option for minor use and minor uses, small uses in major species, or minor species. All aquatic species are considered minor species. Major species are horses, dogs, cats, cattle, pigs, turkey, and chicken, and everything else is considered a minor species, and there are sometimes special things like conditional approvals that are available to help incentivize minor species drug development. So to have a conditional approval, it meets all those standards for the regular approval for safety, and there has to be a reasonable expectation of effectiveness, and if these conditions are met, a conditional approval will allow the company to market a drug for up to 5 years while additional research is being done to confirm effectiveness of the product. And this allows the company to get the drug out earlier, make some money to recoup profits, which is an issue because there's not a lot of profit seen for the companies for minor species applications, and also makes the drug available for folks in the field to use it. Currently, there are no conditional approvals for use in fish, but I wanted to bring this up in case there were to be some in the future. You know exactly what that means. It means that it'll be on the market for up to 5 years. The company has 5 years to satisfy the full approval requirements, at which point, if they haven't, it would not be able to be marketed anymore, but hopefully it moves to an approved status, and then it'll have a full approval. You may be familiar with Aquaculture CA1. There was a conditional approval for the control of mortality to treat catfish with columnaris, and then eventually this became part of a fully approved indication. And it's important to know that anything that's only conditionally approved is not, extra label use is not permitted of these products, just full approvals. There's also something called indexing. There's the index of legally marketed unapproved drugs for minor species. This is an option for non-food minor species. There's a different standard of evaluation that goes into these. It's evaluated by an expert panel that's found to be acceptable to CBM. And again, this class of drugs, there's no extra label use permitted for these drugs. So currently on the index, we have 2 fish drugs, Ovaprim and Aquacalm. You can see their active ingredients and intended use there. All right, so I talked about extra label use, and I want to be clear about what extra label use is. Everything's approved for a specific condition, to treat a specific disease, or to help the functioning of the animal in a certain way. It's approved for a specific dose, timing of treatment, length of treatment. It's approved for specific species as well. So sometimes we might have an approval for not all finfish, but for catfish or salmonids, something like that, based on the data that's been provided to FDA. Anything that you're doing that's not in accordance with the label is considered extra label use. Fortunately, there was a law that was passed, I believe it was in 1994, that allows extra label use of animal drugs and human drugs under specific conditions. One of the conditions is that extra label use has to be authorized by a veterinarian. So, and the additional considerations is this has to be the only option you have. There's not another product out there that's approved, that works, and that you can use it. You should be using that first. If there's no option, then you go to the extra label use. You have to have a valid veterinary client-patient relationship. An extra label use can only, under these conditions, legally can only be for a therapeutic purpose. It can't be used for something like to increase weight gain or feed efficiency in the animal, or for other production needs. The vet is responsible for assigning an appropriate withdrawal time based on information that's out there, and has to keep appropriate records. There is a list of drugs that are prohibited from extra label use, and again, extra label use of conditionally approved and index products is not permitted. And also legally, the extra label use of medicated feeds is not permitted, which you might notice is a problem. So while technically and legally extra label use of medicated feeds is not permitted, FDA recognizes that minor species have an issue, that sometimes medicated feeds are the only option out there to treat fish or other species. And because they're minor species and there's not a big market for these medicines, that there are few medicines, and extra label use is kind of critical to help protect animal health. So FDA has adopted a policy that says that under specific conditions, we are not going to take action if these conditions are met, if there's extra label use of medicated feeds. So these conditions are spelled out in something that's called a compliance policy guide, 615115. A compliance policy guide is a document that gives directions to our field part of FDA, our inspectors out in the field, information on how we want to enforce things. So again, this document describes the specific conditions that we would allow use of extra label use of medicated feeds. In short, if you follow the CPG, FDA is unlikely to take enforcement action against this extra label use. This CPG is just for minor species. So again, all aquatic species would be covered. There was an initial version that was published in 2001, and that it was silent about VFDs. It more was addressed that there could be extra label use of over-the-counter medicated feeds. But we revised this CPG in December of 2016 to include VFDs, to say you could extra label use these VFDs in minor species, again, meeting the conditions of the CPG. So again, this is one of the things for extra label use. There has to be a valid veterinary client-patient relationship. No other treatment options are available. The health of the animals is threatened, and a failure to treat would result in suffering or death. The veterinarian is going to have to write a recommendation in advance or upon diagnosis that describes what's happening with the fish and why this extra label use is needed. Again, it's limited to minor species, and it's also limited to use of certain medicated feeds. So for aquatic species, the only medicated feeds that could be extra labeled are those already approved for other aquatic species or fish. So this, just to be clear, it also doesn't mean that you can put an injectable drug in a medicated feed. Again, you have to take one of those feeds that's approved for fish or aquatic species if you want to use it in fish. And there's similar restrictions for some of the other terrestrial minor species. You can change some nutrient requirements to help out with give you the appropriate formulation you need for minor species, but you can't change the level of the drug that's approved for use in the medicated feed. And it can only be for farmed species, not wildlife. Again, only when the animal's health is threatened, and promotion and advertising of extra label use is not allowed. And then there's certain drugs that are prohibited from extra label drug use. None of the approved medicated feeds for fish fall into that now, but just to be aware of that for the future if that list changes at all. So this is an important document for folks to be familiar with. It'll talk about the importance of assigning withdrawal periods, animal identification, documents that need to be retained, and of course all other legal requirements need to be met, including NPDES requirements. So now for the second part of my presentation, I'm going to shift focus. I want to talk about the change that happened in January 1st of this year. Thank you. Antimicrobials of medical importance in human medicine and that are administered in feed or water to food-producing animals. If they were over-the-counter before, they have transitioned to veterinary feed directive drugs or prescription status. So this is part of a larger group of efforts that FDA has to address antimicrobial resistance, which is becoming an increasingly important global health concern, where antimicrobials are, we're seeing resistance in hospitals and things like that. So a number of the things that we're doing to address antimicrobial resistance is one of the requirements of the approval process for drugs for food animals is there's a microbial food safety assessment that needs to be done. So we look at that risk of potential development of resistance that could happen before we approve the drug. We're also a partner in the National Antimicrobial Resistance Monitoring System, which currently is focused on terrestrial animals, but we're piloting work for seafood. By law, we collect and report information on antimicrobial sales and distribution. We also do education and outreach, collaborate with international partners, and we do research at our research facility to support initiatives like CLSI initiatives. Also, CVM has limited the use of certain antimicrobials where we have concerns, such as cephalosporins, and withdrew the approval of fluoroquinolones for use in poultry. So despite all these efforts, in 2012, FDA said there's more that needs to be done. We need to make sure we're using these antimicrobials judiciously so we can prevent the development of resistance. In 2012, we issued a policy statement discussing the judicious use of medically important antimicrobial drugs in food-producing animals. And so there were two main thoughts in this policy statement, and it's that judicious use of antimicrobials really, obviously, judicious use is for therapeutic purposes. It's not for things like improving weight. You don't want to be using antimicrobials to improve weight gain or feed efficiency uses. There were products that were approved for that, and FDA wanted to see those phased out. Also, another component was to include veterinary oversight for more accountability to prevent misuse of antimicrobials and to incorporate, as Kathleen said, veterinary knowledge in administering the antibiotics. So after that, we had additional direction to the pharmaceutical companies. We said, this is how you can align any of your products that need to be changed to conform to this policy. It was actually a voluntary process, but all the manufacturers of drugs with these antimicrobials said, yes, we're going to do this. They agreed to make the changes to their products over a 3-year period. So by the end of December 2016, we received all the applications that, again, would either withdraw certain approvals or change things to being VFD or prescription, and also remove those weight gain and feed deficiency claims. To go along with this, in 2015, FDA also, after several rounds of public comment, revised the Veterinary Feed Directive regulations in an effort to streamline and make the process, facilitate the process, make it a little less burdensome, but still having the controls that a Veterinary Feed Directive needs for accountability. So again, beginning of this year, there were a number of products that transitioned over, and I'll go over specifically which fish products were affected. We'll talk about what drugs are included and specifically what a veterinary feed directive is and involves. So the classes that were impacted by this policy and this change were ones that are of importance in human medicine. There's a specific list that FDA puts out with consultation to CDC. It's limited to this change was limited to medicated feeds and things administered in water, whether it's drinking water and terrestrial animals, and immersion products for fish. So the oxytetracycline hydrochloride products were affected and are now, that has to be by prescription. So again, basically what I just said, the oxytetracycline products are now prescription-only products, require a veterinary prescription. Coriolon previously was, or always has been, a prescription product, so I wanted to include that to just show all the prescription drugs. And these are treated as any other prescription drugs. These are the veterinary feed directive drugs. So basically all of the products that we have that are approved as medicated feed are veterinary feed directive drugs and will require a veterinary feed directive from a veterinarian in order to use them. So what is a veterinary feed directive? It's a couple things. One is a marketing status. When a drug is approved, it can be approved over the counter, so anybody can go and pick it up off the shelf somewhere. Or it can be approved needing veterinary authorization. So that would come in the form of a prescription for like injectables or water-based products or topicals. But for medicated feeds, it's not a prescription, it's a veterinary feed directive. And the decision is made based on whether a veterinarian's knowledge is needed to use the product safely or effectively. Veterinary feed directive is also the word used for the written statement that a veterinarian puts together to authorize distribution of a medicated feed. This written statement is prepared by the veterinarian and is given to the client, and either the client or the vet can also deliver that authorization to the feed mill. The vet makes the diagnosis, chooses the medication, determines the dose and duration, and notes the withdrawal period and any special notes. And again, this has to be issued within a valid client-patient relationship. So a valid client-patient relationship exists when the veterinarian is licensed and has assumed making the medical judgments for the animals, and that the client and the caretakers, the people taking care of the fish, have agreed to follow all of the veterinarian's directions. The vet has to have a good enough knowledge of the animals to make a preliminary diagnosis and has to be available for follow-up if there are any problems. The veterinarian has to be seen and personally acquainted with the keeping of the animals by virtue of examination of the animals or appropriate and timely visits to the premises. One of the changes when the veterinary feed directive regulations changed in 2015 was this definition. So this definition is now, this is the federal definition has stayed the same, but what we've done is say that if there's state regulations that address a valid veterinary client-patient relationship for VFDs, we're going to defer to the state regulations. There's a list on the FDA CVM website of all the states that have regulations that would meet that criteria. So those would be the regulations to follow for the VCPR. And for states that do not have one that meets those criteria, you would follow the federal definition. So by regulation, there are a number of things that the VFD form has to include. And I'm listing these on these slides. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can see them there. But it's important that the VFD is filled out completely to be valid. As part of the approval process, the drug companies submit a form to us that basically we make sure it captures all this information so it'll be easy to fill out. And then there are other places that have created forms to facilitate this for veterinarians. One of the things that's important to recognize is the VFD expiration date. And this is basically how long that VFD order is good for. The animals must be fed that medicated feed before the end of the expiration date. If you're in the middle of treatment, when the VFD expires, you have to have another VFD to cover the remainder of the treatment. There are no refills allowed on any of the VFD drugs currently, so that means that you can't use a VFD to retreat the same lot of fish. You need to consult the veterinarian and get another VFD if appropriate. So the producer's role, most importantly, is to establish a relationship with a veterinarian and that veterinary client-patient relationship. For treatment, they're going to need to obtain a VFD order form from the veterinarian and provide that to the feed mill unless the veterinarian's done that. They have to, in order for this VFD to be valid, all the conditions on the form written out by the veterinarian have to be followed. And the farmer is going to also have to retain a copy of that VFD for 2 years and provide it to FDA if there were to be an inspection. One thing to do is not panic, but be prepared. as was discussed before, if somebody doesn't have a veterinarian, look out now for who would be a veterinarian that could help write a VFD if treatment was needed. Make sure the vet understands your needs and understand where you're going to get the drug from, with working with the feed mills and everything, so that we're not trying to figure out all these steps when there's a disease outbreak. The feed mills also have requirements for document retention and things like that. There's also a term, a distributor. There can be distributors of the drugs that get the drugs from the feed mills and to further distribute it. They have to notify FDA that they're going to be a distributor if that's the case. So I've gone through a lot of information. All of this information is also available on our website. We've got some great question and answer documents related to fish drug approvals on our website. There's also that animal drugs at FDA database that allows you to type in the drug that you're interested in and get the basic information for that drug. And again, all that information will also be on the drug's label. We have a veterinary feed directive page that has brochures for feed mills, producers, and veterinarians. We have documents like Guidance 120 that basically question and answer documents about the veterinary feed directive process, a list of FDA distributors and feed mills to help you figure out where you're going to get your medicated feeds. Of course, there's a link I've included to the CPG for extra-label use of medicated feeds in minor species. And then again, if you have any questions, please send them in to askcbm, oops, I have a typo, at fda.hhs.gov, so that we can help work through this process. And I'm very interested in following up afterwards if there are areas that folks feel that they have questions or problems, because we'd like to make this as smooth as a process as possible. So we'd like to try to work through issues with folks to figure out how we can streamline that and get information out to folks to help facilitate the process. And that's all I have. I will be around during break and until the middle of today if you have additional questions, or I can take some if we have time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. Idaho Fish and Game approached the Idaho State Veterinary Board to develop a MOU or agreement where the Idaho State Veterinary Board would agree that for VFD that a fish health professional could actually make the diagnosis, and it would protect the veterinarian that relied on that diagnosis to issue a VFD. Ultimately, in the end, the State Veterinary Board decided not to do it. But I guess in a state that would allow that, would that be something that would be acceptable under? You said FDA would defer to the state's definition. Would that be something acceptable?
I think, perhaps? Yeah, if it's listed, again, if it's on our webpage as listed as the states that meet those definitions, yes. But I think as Kathy talked about before, there's opportunity for everybody to be a team. Right. Veterinarians working with diagnosticians and everybody being a team. And we recognize the role fish health professionals play.
And we took a veterinarian that's in the Buell area and took him down to a fish health lab, which Reagan used to have, trained that veterinarian at the fish health lab, took him out to fish farms to look at different things and establish veterinarian-client relationships so we could do the VFDs.
Go ahead.
Yeah, kind of the chicken and egg thing that Dean was talking about as well. Both CAPS and VFDs seem to help in terms of large producers. But smaller producers, it's extremely difficult to get medicated feed in time. And if there is a way to streamline to get, say, chlorphenicol top coat ability, that would be extremely helpful.
I understand that, and that there are, we're working with folks to figure that out. Part of the conditions of an approval are how the medicated feeds are made. So part of our limitation might be what was studied, what was presented as part of the approval practice? Does it have to be in the pellet already, or can it be top coated? So that's one thing to look at, but we're looking at a variety of issues to try to get the feed to folks faster and how to streamline things.
Okay, thanks for your answers.
Okay.
Appreciate it. And thank you for accommodating our schedule. I really appreciate it.